Mark was a quiet man who loved simple things. While others dreamed of tall buildings, shining cars, and busy streets, he found his happiness in a small wooden cabin at the edge of the forest. To him, that cabin was not only a home, it was a piece of his heart, something that held his past and gave meaning to his present. The cabin stood proudly, even though it was old. Its walls were made of thick wooden logs, each one placed by hand many years ago. The roof was covered with strong, dark shingles that had faced many seasons of rain, snow, and sunshine. When the wind blew, the cabin made a soft creaking sound, almost like it was alive and speaking to the trees around it. The cabin was built by Mark's father long before Mark grew old enough to understand the effort behind it. His father was not a rich man, but he had strong hands, a strong will, and a love for quiet life. Every nail hammered, every plank polished, was a sign of patience and care. For his father, building the cabin was not just about shelter, it was about creating a place where the family could always feel safe and close to nature. When Mark was young, he often sat on the porch steps and watched his father work. He remembered the sound of the hammer, the smell of fresh cut wood, and the way sunlight painted golden lines across the half-finished walls. His father used to say, "A house is made of wood and stone, but a home is made of love and memories." At that time, little Mark did not fully understand those words. But now, standing as a grown man, those words lived inside him like a guiding light. The forest around the cabin made the place even more special. Tall pine trees guarded it like silent friends, and the air was always filled with the fresh scent of earth and leaves. Birds sang their morning songs, deer walked softly between the trees, and sometimes a rabbit would hop across the open ground near the porch. At night, the sky opened like a wide blanket of stars, brighter than anything seen in the city. Mark's life in the cabin was simple, but it was full of peace. He woke up with the sun, made himself a cup of tea on the old stove, and sat on the porch watching the light slowly spread across the land. After that, he would spend his day doing small but meaningful tasks, chopping wood for the fire, fixing a broken chair, planting vegetables in the small garden behind the cabin. Each task gave him a sense of calm and purpose. Though Mark lived alone now, he never truly felt lonely. His father had passed away years ago, but his presence was everywhere in the cabin. The rocking chair on the porch still held the memory of evenings when they sat together, talking about life. The tools hanging neatly in the shed still carried his father's touch. Even the cracks on the wall seemed like stories written in silence, reminding Mark that his father's spirit would always stay near. Sometimes, people in nearby towns would wonder why Mark chose to stay in an old cabin instead of moving to a modern house. To them, the cabin was just wood and nails. But to Mark, it was a treasure of memories. Every corner spoke of love. Every sound of the forest reminded him of his childhood. Moving away would mean leaving behind the last piece of his father, and that was something he could never do. One autumn morning, Mark stood outside the cabin, breathing in the cool, crisp air. The trees had started to turn golden, their leaves falling gently like little sparks of sunlight. He held an axe in his hand, ready to chop wood for the coming winter. As he raised the axe, he smiled softly to himself. This was his rhythm, his life, and he felt thankful for it. But little did Mark know, his quiet days were about to change. The world outside the forest was moving faster than he realized. Rules, papers, and communities were spreading, reaching even the far edges of the land. And one day, that world would knock on his cabin door, trying to question his place on the land his father had left him. For now, though, Mark knew nothing of it. He only knew the gentle sound of wind moving through the pine trees and the strength of his father's legacy that lived inside the wooden walls. To him, the cabin was not just a retreat from the world, it was proof that love, patience, and memories could build something stronger than time. And as he stood there, watching the smoke rise slowly from the chimney, he felt certain of one thing: this was home, and nothing could ever take it away. The morning was quiet, the kind of quiet that only existed deep in the forest. Mark had just finished stacking firewood near the shed. The air was cool, and golden light slipped gently through the tall pine trees. He wiped the sweat from his forehead, feeling content with the work he had done. For him, each small task added another layer of peace to his day. As he bent down to pick up another log, the sound of footsteps broke the calm. They were not the soft steps of a deer or the quick hops of a rabbit. These footsteps were steady, firm, and human. Mark straightened slowly, his eyes narrowing toward the dirt path that led into the forest. Soon, a woman appeared, walking briskly toward him. She was neatly dressed, holding a clipboard tightly against her chest. Her face carried the expression of someone who expected to be listened to. Her name was Karen, and she introduced herself without much warmth. "You live here?" she asked sharply, glancing at the cabin as if it was something out of place. Mark nodded politely. "Yes. This is my home." Karen looked down at her clipboard, flipping a few papers before speaking again. "Well, according to our records, this area falls under the community association now. Your cabin doesn't meet the standards, and you are technically trespassing on community property. You'll have to leave." Mark stood still, taking in her words. The forest had always been open and free. He knew every tree, every trail, every stream. This was not just land, it was his family's land. His father had worked on it, cared for it, and passed it down to him. Hearing someone call him a trespasser on his own soil felt strange and unreal. With calmness in his voice, Mark replied, "I believe there must be some mistake. This cabin was built by my father many years ago, and this land has always been ours." But Karen did not seem interested in explanations. She tapped her pen against the clipboard and shook her head. "That may be what you think, but things have changed. The association is responsible for keeping order, and cabins like this don't fit. You need to move out." Her words were sharp, cutting into the peaceful air of the morning. Mark felt a tightness in his chest, not of anger, but of sadness. How could someone walk into the forest, look at the home filled with his father's memory, and treat it like it was just a problem on a list? He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Ma'am, I cannot leave. This is more than just wood and stone. This is my family's home." Karen frowned, her voice rising slightly. "Rules are rules. If you don't follow them, there will be consequences." Mark said nothing. He simply looked at her, his eyes calm but unshaken. The forest around them seemed to listen quietly, as if waiting to see what would happen next. A bird chirped high in the trees, breaking the silence for just a moment, before everything grew still again. Karen, clearly displeased with his refusal, pulled out her phone. "If you won't leave on your own, I'll have to call the authorities." Her tone was certain, as if she had dealt with such matters many times before. Mark's heart sank slightly, but he did not lose his composure. "Do what you feel you must," he said softly. His voice carried no anger, only a tired acceptance of the trouble that was about to begin. She dialed quickly, speaking into the phone with sharp confidence. "Yes, this is the president of the community association. There's a man refusing to leave property he doesn't own. Please send someone immediately." Mark turned away quietly and walked back to the porch of his cabin. He sat down on the old rocking chair that once held his father. The chair creaked gently, a familiar sound that reminded him of evenings spent together long ago. He looked out at the trees, the sunlight shifting across the ground, and tried to keep his heart steady. Inside, he felt a mix of emotions. He was not afraid of losing the cabin, because deep down he knew the truth: this land was his. But he was saddened by how quickly people judged without understanding, how quickly they claimed authority over something they had no history with. Karen stood a few steps away, waiting with her arms crossed, her clipboard still clutched tightly. Her eyes moved from the cabin to the man sitting calmly, as if she could not understand how he was so composed. For her, rules were paper and signatures. For Mark, home was memory and love. The quiet stretched between them until, in the distance, the faint sound of an engine grew louder. A car was making its way up the dirt path, moving slowly but steadily. Karen straightened proudly, certain that help was on its way. Mark, however, only leaned back in his chair, his eyes soft but firm. He knew this was only the beginning. The cabin had stood through storms, snow, and time itself. It had survived years of change, and he believed it would survive this too. As the sound of the car drew nearer, the forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment when the outside world would step directly into Mark's quiet life. And in that moment, Mark realized that the peace he had always taken for granted was about to be tested. The sound of the approaching engine grew louder, disturbing the peaceful rhythm of the forest. Birds flew from the trees, and dry leaves rustled under the steady weight of tires pressing against the dirt road. Mark remained seated on his rocking chair, his hands resting calmly on his knees. His heart was steady, though he could feel a small ache deep inside, an ache that came not from fear but from the thought of strangers trying to challenge the home his father had built. Karen stood tall, her arms folded across her chest, her expression carrying the certainty of someone who believed she was about to win. She kept glancing at Mark as though expecting him to panic or at least show signs of worry. But Mark's stillness unsettled her. He looked too calm, too sure, as if he knew something she did not. Soon, a sheriff's car appeared between the trees, the sunlight glinting off its windows. The vehicle came to a slow stop in front of the cabin. Dust rose into the air before gently settling back onto the ground. A door opened, and a tall man in uniform stepped out. His face was weathered, carrying the kind of lines that come from years of listening to people argue about right and wrong. Karen quickly rushed forward, pointing toward Mark and his cabin. "Officer, thank goodness you came," she said in a hurried voice. "This man refuses to leave. He's living here illegally, and I'm the president of the community association. This property belongs to the neighborhood, not him. He needs to be removed immediately." The sheriff raised his hand slightly, asking for calm. His eyes moved to Mark, who sat quietly, not saying a word. For a long moment, the sheriff said nothing, only studying the man on the porch. Then, with slow steps, he walked toward him. "Afternoon, sir," the sheriff greeted kindly. Mark nodded in return. "Afternoon, Sheriff. Would you like to explain your side?" the sheriff asked gently, his voice calm and professional. Mark stood up slowly, not in a rush, and walked inside the cabin. Karen's eyes followed him, impatience rising within her. She tapped her foot on the ground and muttered under her breath about how rules must be rules. Moments later, Mark returned holding a thick leather folder. The corners of the folder were worn, showing years of careful handling. He handed it to the sheriff without a word. The sheriff opened it and began flipping through the pages. There were maps, property deeds, signed documents, and official records that stretched back years. Each page was neatly placed, as though it had been preserved with respect and care. Karen stepped closer, peeking at the folder, but the sheriff moved slightly to block her view. He continued to read, his eyebrows lifting once or twice as he turned the papers. Finally, he closed the folder and looked at Karen. "Ma'am," the sheriff began, his voice steady but firm, "this man is not trespassing. In fact, according to these documents, he owns this cabin and the land surrounding it. There's no mistake here." Karen's face froze. "That can't be right," she argued, her voice trembling with disbelief. "The association has control of this area. We have rules, guidelines, and papers of our own." The sheriff shook his head. "I've seen the official county records. This folder shows clear ownership. Not only does he own this cabin, but it appears he owns the entire county land around it. This isn't association property. It's his property. Silence filled the space between them. The forest, the trees, even the gentle breeze seemed to pause in that moment. Karen's confidence began to crack. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out at first. She finally managed to whisper, the entire county. Mark gave a small nod. My father left it to me. He made sure everything was in order before he passed. I've never needed to say it out loud because no one ever questioned it. Karen's face turned pale. She looked down at her clipboard, suddenly realizing how powerless her papers and signatures were compared to the documents the sheriff had just seen. Her sense of authority faded like smoke in the wind. The sheriff handed the folder back to Mark with a respectful nod. Sir, your ownership is clear. You don't have to worry. No one can force you off this land. Then, turning to Karen, he added, Ma'am, you had no right to make that call. I suggest you leave this man in peace. Karen opened her mouth as if to argue again but quickly closed it. For once, the words she relied on so heavily had abandoned her. Her clipboard hung loosely at her side, no longer a shield of power but just a stack of papers that meant nothing here. Mark remained calm. He didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't throw her mistake back in her face. Instead, he spoke softly, his voice carrying the weight of patience. Sometimes, it's better to ask before assuming. Karen looked at him, her pride wounded, her cheeks warm with embarrassment. She wanted to say something more, but nothing came. The sheriff gave her one last look, firm yet kind, reminding her with his eyes that this was not a place for unnecessary battles. And so, in that quiet forest clearing, with the cabin standing tall behind him, Mark's ownership was confirmed. But deep inside, he knew this was not the end of the trouble. People who sought power rarely gave up so easily. Still, for that moment, he stood in the strength of truth, holding the legacy of his father in his hands. The sheriff stood quietly in front of the cabin, his boots pressing into the dry soil, his eyes steady on Karen and then on Mark. The air between the three of them was heavy, as though even the tall pines were waiting to see what would happen next. The morning calm had been disturbed, and though the forest seemed silent, there was a kind of quiet tension floating all around. Karen broke the silence first. She lifted her chin high and spoke quickly, her words sharp like arrows. Officer, I respect your uniform, but I believe you may be misunderstanding the situation. I'm the elected president of the community association, and this land falls under our responsibility. Cabins like this do not follow community rules. It is my duty to make sure standards are kept. The sheriff listened patiently. His expression did not change, though his eyes carried a calm firmness. He had dealt with many situations in his years: neighbors fighting over fences, families arguing about inheritance, people clashing over land. He knew the difference between someone speaking with knowledge and someone speaking with pride. Mark stood quietly on the porch, his hands resting lightly on the wooden railing. He didn't interrupt. He didn't argue. Instead, he waited, letting the sheriff and Karen speak first. His calmness was not weakness, it was the steady patience of a man who carried truth in his hands. After Karen finished, the sheriff turned back to Mark. Sir, do you have any further documents besides what I have already seen? He asked in a clear voice. Mark gave a gentle nod and disappeared into the cabin. A few moments later, he returned carrying another envelope, thick with carefully folded papers. He handed it to the sheriff, who took his time reading through the contents. The papers were old but well kept. They showed maps with faded lines, official seals, and signatures of people long gone. Each page was a piece of history, proving that the land had been passed down through the generations. The sheriff studied them carefully, then returned them to Mark with a respectful nod. Karen shifted from one foot to the other, clearly uneasy. She tapped her clipboard against her arm, her voice sharper now. These documents may look real, but the association also has its own rules. If he continues to stay here, the neighborhood will be affected. We must think of the greater good. The sheriff looked at her directly. His voice grew firmer. Ma'am, with all respect, the law is clear. Ownership does not belong to the association. It belongs to him. You cannot remove a man from his own land. This cabin is his home, and he has every right to live here in peace. Karen's lips tightened. For the first time, her confidence seemed to falter. She opened her mouth as if to argue, but the sheriff raised a hand gently, stopping her. Let me explain something important, the sheriff continued. Community associations may create rules about fences, gardens, or paint colors, but they cannot take away ownership. This land is not under your authority. It belongs to him, and no vote or rulebook can change that. The weight of his words filled the clearing. Karen's face flushed with a mix of frustration and embarrassment. She looked at her clipboard, flipping through the pages as if she might find something that could prove her right. But no paper could outweigh the truth written in the deeds Mark held. Mark remained quiet, his eyes soft but steady. He didn't look at Karen with anger. Instead, there was almost a sadness in his gaze, as though he wished she could understand that some things in life could not be ruled by boards or associations. Some things, like family, memory, and legacy, stood far above such measures. The sheriff finally turned back to Mark. You have nothing to fear, he said in a kind but firm tone. Your ownership is clear. If anyone tries to trouble you again, you call me directly. Mark gave a small nod. Thank you, Sheriff. His words were simple, but his heart carried deep relief. The sheriff adjusted his hat, ready to leave. But before walking away, he gave Karen one last look. Ma'am, I suggest you let this matter rest. This land is his, and nothing you do will change that. Sometimes, respecting the truth is better than fighting against it. Karen stood still, her face pale. She was a woman who was used to being listened to, used to people obeying her rules. But here, in front of the cabin built by a father's hands, her authority meant nothing. For the first time in a long time, she found herself without power, without control, and without the words to command the situation. The sheriff walked back to his car, his step slow and steady. The engine started, and the sound of the vehicle slowly faded into the distance, leaving behind silence once again. Mark returned to his rocking chair, the old wood creaking gently under his weight. He looked out at the forest, the tall trees standing like guardians around him. For a moment, peace returned. But deep in his heart, he knew this was not the end. Karen's pride had been wounded, and pride often found ways to fight back. As the sun began to sink lower in the sky, painting the forest with golden light, Mark closed his eyes for a moment and whispered softly to himself, Father, I will protect this home, just as you protected it before me. The forest seemed to answer with the rustle of leaves, as though promising him its quiet strength. The sheriff's car had gone, leaving behind only the soft sound of the forest. The air seemed lighter, but Karen stood frozen in place, her clipboard pressed against her chest. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. For someone who always lived with certainty, who always believed her words carried weight, this moment felt like a sharp crack in the middle of her pride. She looked at Mark, sitting calmly on his rocking chair once again. The old chair creaked gently, moving back and forth, as if nothing had happened. His calmness unsettled her even more. He was not celebrating, not mocking, not even looking at her with anger. Instead, his silence seemed heavier than any speech. Karen finally found her voice, though it came out weaker than before. The entire county, she repeated, her words trembling. You own all of this. Her eyes moved from the cabin to the trees, to the dirt path, and even to the distant hills. It was too large for her to take in. Mark gave a quiet nod. His voice was gentle when he spoke. Yes. My father took care of everything before he passed. He made sure the land would stay in the family. It has always been ours. Karen's grip on the clipboard loosened. The papers she had held so tightly now felt small and powerless. All the rules, all the signatures, all the guidelines she believed in meant nothing against the strong truth of ownership. For years, she had carried authority through her position in the community, but now she stood in front of a man whose rights were far greater than any rulebook she could hold. I didn't know, Karen admitted softly. Her usual confidence was gone. She looked down, avoiding Mark's steady gaze. For once, her voice had no command in it, only uncertainty. Mark leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. That is the problem, he said kindly. Sometimes, we act without knowing. Sometimes, we believe rules are greater than truth. But the truth doesn't change, no matter how strong the rules seem. The words were simple, but they carried weight. Karen felt them press against her pride, against the wall of certainty she had built over the years. She had always believed she was protecting order, but in this moment, she realized she had been standing on the wrong side of it. Silence stretched between them again. The forest, as if sensing the shift, grew quiet, letting only the soft whisper of the wind through the trees be heard. Karen finally spoke again, her voice lower. You could have told me from the beginning. You could have said you owned it all. Mark's eyes softened, though his tone remained calm. Would you have listened? Or would you have argued anyway? Karen looked away. Deep down, she knew the answer. Her pride would not have let her believe without proof. She had needed the sheriff to confirm it, to place the truth in front of her eyes, because her own certainty had been too loud to hear anything else. Mark leaned back in his chair again, his face calm. I don't blame you, he said gently. But I hope you understand now. This cabin is more than wood and nails. This land is more than dirt and trees. It is memory. It is legacy. It is my father's gift to me, and I will protect it. The words struck something inside Karen. She had always lived in neat houses, behind painted fences, inside neighborhoods filled with rules and meetings. To her, home had always been about order and appearance. But here, standing in front of this simple cabin, she felt something different. She saw a home built not by rules but by love and patience. Her eyes softened, though her pride still held her back from admitting too much. I didn't mean to cause trouble, she whispered, almost to herself. Mark didn't answer. He simply looked out at the trees, the sunlight falling gently on the leaves. His silence was not cold, it was peaceful, like someone who did not need to argue anymore. Karen shifted uneasily. She felt smaller than she ever had before, standing there with her clipboard that no longer meant anything. For the first time, she realized that not every place belonged to the association, not every home needed rules to protect it. Some homes protected themselves through history, through love, and through truth that could not be erased. Finally, Karen turned slowly, her steps heavy as she began to walk back down the dirt path. Each step echoed with the weight of her pride, now cracked and uncertain. She did not look back, though she could feel Mark's quiet gaze on her as she left. Mark watched her go, not with anger, but with a calm sadness. He knew this was not the last time he would see her. People like Karen, who built their lives on authority, rarely let go so easily. But for now, the cabin stood in peace, its wooden walls glowing softly in the late afternoon sun. The rocking chair creaked once more as Mark leaned back. He breathed in the forest air, the familiar scent of pine and earth filling his chest. He thought of his father, of the strong hands that built the home, of the wisdom that had kept it safe through the years. And as the wind moved gently through the trees, Mark whispered to himself, the truth always speaks louder than pride. The forest seemed to agree, rustling its leaves softly, as though promising him that no matter what came next, the truth of his ownership would stand tall, just like the cabin and the trees that surrounded it. The path back to the town was long and quiet, but Karen's thoughts were anything but calm. Each step she took felt heavy, as though her pride weighed her down. The clipboard she had carried like a symbol of power now felt like nothing more than a stack of useless papers. For years, she had been the voice of authority in her neighborhood. People listened when she spoke. People obeyed when she gave instructions. But today, in front of that small cabin, her voice had meant nothing. She replayed the sheriff's words in her mind again and again, "This land is not under your authority. It belongs to him." Those words stung deeply. She had walked into the forest certain of her role, certain of her control, but she had walked out uncertain of herself. When she reached the edge of town, the familiar sight of neat houses lined in perfect rows greeted her eyes. Painted fences, trimmed gardens, and mailboxes standing like soldiers gave her the sense of order she was used to. Yet somehow, that order felt weaker now. The image of the cabin, simple, rough, but full of life, kept coming back to her mind. She went inside her own house and sat at the kitchen table, the clipboard resting silently beside her. For the first time, she didn't feel like picking it up. She didn't feel like checking rules or sending notices. Instead, she sat still, staring out the window, her mind wandering back to the man who had spoken so calmly. Mark had not raised his voice. He had not mocked her. He had simply stood in quiet truth. That calmness unsettled her because she realized it came from something stronger than authority. It came from history, from love, from belonging. Karen folded her hands together and whispered to herself, "Why do I feel so small?" It wasn't a feeling she liked. She was used to being respected, used to being seen as strong. But strength built only on control now seemed fragile. She had built her pride on rules, but Mark had built his strength on roots. Meanwhile, back in the forest, Mark sat quietly on his porch, rocking slowly in the chair that once held his father. The forest around him was peaceful again, though he knew it was only temporary. He understood human pride too well. He knew Karen's silence would not last forever. Still, he chose not to worry. Worrying would not protect his home. Only patience and truth would. That night, as the stars spread across the sky, Karen lay awake in her bed, unable to sleep. Her mind kept returning to the words Mark had spoken, "This is more than wood and nails. This land is my father's gift." She turned onto her side, pulling the blanket tightly around her shoulders, but the words stayed with her. She began to wonder, had she misunderstood the meaning of home all along? Her own house was perfect, yes. But was it truly a home? It was painted, decorated, and filled with furniture, but it carried no deep history, no legacy. If she left tomorrow, would anyone remember her presence in that place? The next morning, she avoided the neighbors. Usually, she loved walking outside, greeting people, reminding them of rules, feeling in control. But that day, she stayed inside. Her pride was too sore, and she didn't want anyone to see the cracks in it. As for Mark, his day was the same as always. He chopped wood, tended the garden, and carried water from the stream. Each task reminded him that he was not alone. His father's spirit lived in every corner of the cabin. The quiet strength of the land itself seemed to support him, whispering through the trees that he was right to stand his ground. Days passed like this. Karen remained quiet, her usual voice absent from neighborhood meetings. Some people noticed her silence but did not ask questions. They assumed she was busy, though in truth, she was lost in thought. She often sat at her kitchen table, staring at the clipboard that once gave her pride. Now, it only reminded her of the moment she had been proven wrong. A part of her wanted to forget, to move on, but another part of her could not let go. Her pride, though cracked, was not gone. It whispered to her in the quiet moments, telling her that she must not accept defeat so easily. Karen felt torn. One side of her longed to admit her mistake, to respect the man who had shown her what true ownership meant. The other side of her, the part built from years of being in control, refused to stay silent forever. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in orange and gold, Karen stood at her window, looking toward the distant forest. The tall trees stood like guardians, protecting something she could never touch. She whispered to herself, "This isn't over." But in her heart, there was also a softer voice, a quieter, unfamiliar voice that asked, "Do you really need to fight?" For the first time, Karen realized she was not only fighting against Mark, but also against herself. And in that battle, silence became her only companion. The forest stood quietly, unchanged and eternal. The tall pine trees whispered in the wind, and the wooden cabin rested calmly among them, as if it had always belonged there. For Mark, the days after the confrontation passed in peace. He rose with the sun, carried out his simple chores, and ended his evenings watching the stars from the porch. Yet in his heart, he knew this calm was not only the work of nature, it was also the strength of truth. Karen, however, carried a storm within her. Days had turned into weeks since the sheriff had confirmed Mark's ownership of the land. On the outside, she went about her usual life in town, but inside, she was unsettled. Pride and humility fought silently within her. Every time she looked at her clipboard, she remembered the moment when her authority had collapsed in front of the cabin. The sound of the sheriff's voice, the calmness of Mark's words, the weight of the documents, all of it returned to her mind like an echo. She could not forget, no matter how hard she tried. One afternoon, Karen decided she could no longer live with the unease. She needed to see the cabin again, not to fight, not to argue, but to understand. With hesitant steps, she made her way down the dirt path into the forest. Mark was on the porch, repairing a wooden chair when he noticed her approach. He did not stand immediately or speak quickly. Instead, he set down his tools gently and looked at her with the same calm eyes as before. Karen stopped a few feet away. For a long moment, she said nothing. The forest filled the silence with the sound of rustling leaves and distant bird calls. Finally, she spoke, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. "I came to say I was wrong." Mark tilted his head slightly, but he did not interrupt. He waited, giving her the space to continue. Karen's eyes lowered to the ground. "I let pride guide me. I thought my position gave me power, but I forgot that some things stand above rules. Your cabin, your land. I didn't see what it truly meant. I only saw papers and standards. But now I realize it is more than that. It is your father's gift. It is your home. And I should not have tried to take it from you." Her words were slow, but each one carried honesty. For the first time, her pride did not control her. Mark leaned back in his chair and studied her quietly. His voice, when it came, was steady and gentle. "It takes strength to admit when we are wrong. I respect that." Karen lifted her eyes, surprised at his kindness. She had expected anger, perhaps even cold silence. But instead, she found patience. He continued, "I never wished to fight with you. I only wished to live in peace. My father built this cabin with love, and I promised myself I would protect it. That is all I ever wanted." Karen nodded slowly. The burden on her chest felt lighter with every passing word. For weeks, she had carried the weight of shame and stubbornness, but now, standing in front of the man she had once challenged, she felt the release of honesty. For a while, they stood together in silence. The forest surrounded them, timeless and forgiving. Karen noticed the small details of the cabin for the first time, the way the logs fit together, the smoke rising gently from the chimney, the flowers blooming near the porch steps. It was simple, yes, but it was beautiful in a way no neighborhood design could ever match. Finally, Karen took a small breath and said, "I will not trouble you again. I may not understand everything, but I understand enough now. This place is yours, and it always will be." Mark gave a small smile, the kind that carried both gratitude and peace. "Thank you," he said simply. With those words, something shifted between them. Karen no longer felt like an enemy standing before him. She felt like a visitor who had finally understood the truth of the place. She turned to leave, her steps lighter than when she had arrived. As she walked back down the path, she looked once more over her shoulder. The cabin stood strong, surrounded by the tall trees and bathed in golden light. For the first time, she saw it not as an obstacle to order, but as a symbol of something greater: heritage, memory, and the quiet strength of belonging. Back on the porch, Mark watched her go. He did not feel triumph. He did not feel the need to celebrate her apology. Instead, he felt a deep calm. The land was safe, the truth had been recognized, and peace had returned. That evening, as the stars appeared one by one in the clear night sky, Mark sat in his rocking chair and thought of his father. "It's over now," he whispered softly, almost as if speaking to the memory of the man who had built the home. "The cabin is safe. The land is safe. And I will keep it that way." The forest answered with the gentle sound of the wind moving through the pine trees, like a promise that the land would always stand with him. And in that moment, Mark knew something important. Peace was not only the absence of conflict, it was also the presence of truth. And as long as the truth of his father's legacy lived in the cabin and the land around it, peace would never leave him again.